Hello, hello. So I wanted to um, continue with this idea I had, which is to memorize like all the games of one really prominent player. And my favorite players are Anand, Fischer, Carlsen, Kramnik, and obviously Morphy. So this video we're going to analyze a relatively unknown Morphy game which is very instructive and has some very unique features. And it features a really nice endgame. So without further ado, let's dive right into it. So the game begins with 1d4 by Mr. Lichtenheim. Apparently, well, the site Chessmetrics gives Mr. Lichtenheim a rating of about 2371. So he's about FM strength. Now, of course, the chess matrix isn't a perfect metric, but it's still something. It's not something to scoff at. So it may not be the most accurate tool, but yeah, I mean that indication isn't so far off. And for Morphy, they give about 2661 in the period in which this game was played. When this game was played, which is 1857. So anyway, Morphy responds with the f5. Now there's this book about Morphy by Mr. Philip Sargent, and Sargent is a 20th century guy who wrote about these players like Pillsbury and Morphy. And in his book, he says that this is Morphy's favorite defense to d4, and it's really an indication of the era back then, where asymmetric openings, gambits, wild stuff, the romantic spirit basically was on full display. So now White goes for a somewhat weird move, knight c3. Nowadays, mostly people play d4. Can't draw arrows as usual. And knight c3 is sort of like a Veresov, has a Veresov-like feel. The Veresov is when you play knight c3 blocking in the c pawn. This used to be considered somewhat of a positional mistake, but I mean, by some theorists, but it's not that much of a mistake. It's just a different way of playing. Now, maybe some people will tell you the Veresov is an inferior way of playing, and they wouldn't be that wrong, but okay. So, knight c3, the idea is that instead of going for c4 and controlling these squares, well, mainly the d5 square, White instead wants to control the e4 square. He wants to break early on with e4. And that's exactly what happens, and basically can't be prevented unless you play d5 now. Then White prepares it with f3, and it's another type of game. So anyway, sorry about that. They go for Morphy goes for knight f6. So, what to say about this position? Well, I want to really explain the opening in detail here. So, I came up with these like piece position maps. So, in this position, this opening position, it's important to consider where the pieces belong. For White, the dark square bishop doesn't belong on the board. As I say in the notes, it should be off the board. Why is that? Well, White really wants to break with e4, right? And what's preventing that e4 break? The f6 knight. So White needs to get rid of the knight, and he does that by playing bishop g5 and trading on f6. So he really just wants to throw that bishop in the garbage bin and have better control over e4. That's where the dark square bishop belongs. Now, what about the light square bishop? The light square bishop probably belongs on d3. On d3, it offsets black's own bishop. Now, black's own bishop is best developed on b7 because that's a really long diagonal for it. And in this structure, it's blocked by the f pawn, so it doesn't make sense to develop it to d7 or e6. But on the other hand, since you won't play d5, well, you could in this opening, of course, but in most traditional theory in this Raphael variation, you won't play this. So you go b6 and bishop b7 and have a really nice long diagonal, and again I can't draw arrows. And for that reason, the bishop on d3 is great, because when white gets in the e4 push, you can trade the bishops off, this powerful bishop for this somewhat bad bishop. Okay, what about the kingside knight? Probably f3 is the best square, especially after you trade on g5, but maybe e2 is possible. Only after you play the bishop to d3. You don't want to play the knight to e2, unless maybe then you fianchetto, but probably you won't have the option to fianchetto if you have the knight on e2 and you've played g3, because then after black plays bishop b7, the long diagonal would be exposed, and you don't have a knight on f3 to develop your bishop to g2 because the knight is on e2. Okay, I hope that made sense, but I'm going over this point quickly because it's not that important. Anyway, the queenside knight is on its best square. Well, probably you'd want the pawn to be here anyway, but you know, that's what you did in the opening. So c3 is the best square, really. a3 and d2 don't make much sense. What about the queen? The queen needs to be on an aggressive square. In this game it comes out to h5 and should have gone to h6 but didn't, but that's another topic. e2 is also possible after you develop the bishop to d3, aiming to trade with bishop e4 after you've played the e4 break and black has the bishop here. So that's one idea, that's another idea. But really the queen needs to be on an aggressive square, because in this opening white needs aggression. And you see that probably white shouldn't trade queens. That's another idea of this opening. Why shouldn't he trade queens? Because he has the quicker initiative. He played all of this just to get e4 in quickly, and that means central control, and central controls means leads to a lead in development, and this lead in development should be exploited by keeping the queens on board. And also you notice that if the queen is maybe on h6 and the bishop isn't on this diagonal, so the queen is on h6, yeah, it's not hanging. So if the queen is on h6, it stops black from castling, and that contributes to white's initiative. So yeah, the queen should be on an aggressive square. The king should probably be castled queenside, again keeping with the aggressive mindset white is trying to play, but also kingside works. And do note that if the knight is developed on f3, the b7 bishop is very strong. So on the king side you're just going into black's attack, but on the queen side you're not, you're avoiding it. So that's another point in favor of queenside castling for white. The rooks probably belong on their natural squares, e1, d1, maybe f1 for if you're castled kingside, or in some other situations when you're castled queenside. So yeah, that's about it. Okay, I didn't mean to do that. Now, as for black's bishop has many options. If your bishop, the white bishop should develop to g5, and it probably goes to e7 after that. But if white delays it by a move, the development of the g5 bishop, like if he plays knight f3 here, you can go g6 maybe, and after bishop g5 play bishop g7. Then that's a different type of opening. But I don't like bishop g7 so much. It's a bit of a waste of tempo. So the bishop belongs on e7, and if the knight is gone, you can probably put it on f6 where it has better support. What's very important in this opening is to keep in mind that the light squared bishop always belongs on b7. We mentioned this before, but again, it's because it's the long diagonal and the bishop is blocked in by this pawn, so it doesn't make sense to put it here. The kingside knight is of course on its best square, f6. I mean, e7 doesn't make any sense, and h6 makes less than no sense. The queenside knight, probably it should be on c6, but if you don't want to block in your b7 bishop, you have some reason to put it on d7, but probably the best controlling the center is more important from c6, where you control d4 and d4, sorry, and e5. The king should of course be castled kingside, no argument about that. Castling queenside may be possible in some positions, but I really doubt it. Now, the queen and the rooks, it's a bit difficult to say where exactly they belong. Just natural open files where they support something, but it's very position dependent. The queen's development should also probably be delayed, unless you have like a bishop on f6 and you can play queen e7 and rook e8 to support an e5 break or something. That might be an idea. Anyway, here white correctly plays bishop g5, aiming to trade the bishop. Now, some games have been played with d5. It's not wrong, of course, allowing white the ability to capture, and after black recaptures, we have like this bishop pair versus pawn structure theme that's apparent in many chess games. But Morphy doesn't opt for that, and I guess at the times it wasn't so encouraged to, or so it wasn't so encouraged for people to play like that. People weren't that encouraged to actually go into these battles because they thought that the pawn structure was really hampered their chances. Just guessing here, maybe Morphy had other reasons to play e6. Also, e6 makes a lot of sense, I mean. Anyway. So, white goes for e4. And that's a very principled move, of course. When black has to recapture, he's now pinned after knight takes e4. So he has to play bishop e7, and now white's initiative is felt. So actually Sargent here recommends bishop takes f6, which is a nice idea. Of course you can't take with the f-pawn because there's queen h5 check. So queen takes f6 and knight e4. You gain a tempo, and now the queen has to retreat. I used to retreat to d8 in this line because I've been in this position before, but apparently it's a bit wrong because you're undeveloping way too much. You should go to g6, and after bishop d3 there are some problems. Sorry, to h6, not g6. G6 just runs into bishop d3. Yeah, I should go to h6. Yeah, I remember analyzing this, and I think I'm the one who donated the depth you see here to Stockfish. But anyway, so Sargent recommended that, but this isn't wrong at all, and it's been seen. I can show you a top level game here where knight f3 was played. Now in the game, white went for queen h5 check, which is also an interesting variation, but he continued in lackluster fashion. After knight f3, this is basically the main line nowadays. Castles is possible, but the more principled b6 has been tried. And I'll quickly show you a game between Lamy and Drainderman. And Lamy, he was playing the white pieces, and an interesting battle ensued. So you can see here that the bishop went to f6, as we said. The right square bishops were traded off, as we also mentioned will happen. The rooks e8, d8, natural files. The e files probably are the most natural for the rooks, but again, they differ according to each position. And yeah, Reinderman went for an interesting queen sacrifice, I guess, for two rooks, but the position was probably better for the queen here. And Lamy did a good job of converting it. Here he played a really nice move, and the endgame is won. As most pawn up, king and pawn endgames are. So anyway, that was an interesting side variation. You see how the pieces developed where we said they would develop. This happens in almost, well, not almost all, but you know, I'd say a huge majority of games go on like this. Now you might have some crazy person who develop, like, I don't know, the bishop to d7 and still win the game, but that's probably not the idea of the opening. Anyway, so queen h5 check. The idea here is a bit faulty because white went for knight takes f6 check. As we said, we don't really want to trade queens in this opening. It's lackluster. It's timid. I know you're playing Morphy and you're afraid you want to trade queens, you want to go into an endgame, but yeah, you shouldn't do that because your initiative, you have the initiative, you have the strength. After queen h6, black is really cramped. Like let's say bishop e7, you have queen g7, and here you're completely winning. Like rook f8, you just take this pawn. You even have h4 ideas, maybe even knight f3 is a big threat. You have many options here, and they're all better for white, much better in fact. Probably I'd just take the pawn, to be honest. So you have a big initiative after queen h6, and black can't castle. If he were able to castle, he'd probably be quite happy, but he can't. And after, say, here in this position, bishop takes d4, you can pause the video if you want to find the move, but it's shown on the screen anyway. It's castles, and here you're again attacking this bishop, you're again gaining a tempo like you did with queen h6, and no matter where the bishop goes, you have just a huge attack. This is one line that illustrates this. And after bishop f6, let's say, also you have this h4 h5 idea. So always keep this h4 h5 idea in mind if you're playing this as white. Okay, let's do this again. h4 and h5. So you basically win a pawn and have a huge initiative and an attack. That's why queen h6 was a really good move. So he can't take on d4, he can't play bishop e7. He has to play queen e7 here. And after this sequence, white has an enjoyable game. In this position, actually, black gets to castle queenside, but that's only because white prevented him from doing so. And maybe even the sacrifice of d5 here is somewhat interesting. So actually I haven't checked this with an engine. The idea just popped into my mind right now, so let's just take a quick glance to see what the engine thinks. But anyway, these are like the ideas. So that's why queen h6 is a much better move. So as you noticed, yeah, the engine likes it. Unsurprisingly, the engine always likes my moves. Just kidding, please don't look at my games. Okay, so actually what's really interesting is that if black doesn't make use of the option to go to h6 with his queen, then white should do that. So you see in this game, white should have went with the queen to h6. But as I told you about the line I used to face here, where was it? Oops, that went too far. So yeah, in the line I told you I face usually, like after this one, then queen h6 should be played. So it's either black playing queen h6 or white. So the first one to go to h6 is the winner, sort of. Anyway, so white chose to go for knight takes f6 check, which is really timid, just going for a queen trade. Now Morphy plays an interesting move, which is a bit of an amateurish move because it immediately releases the tension. A more let's say professional move would be rook f8 or even castles, so that if white captures, black develops a piece. But the argument here is that Morphy wants to extend white's pawn chain. And this is actually a very deep concept, and it actually happens in the game. So white wants to extend, so black wants to extend white's pawn chain. So he wants the pawn to be on e5, so that after f4, he has a target. The f pawn is on the f file. And if the f pawn were to move, then the e pawn, which would be isolated, and this is what happened in the game, becomes extremely weak. While in this structure, Morphy really doesn't have a weakness to attack. I mean, this pawn may be a bit weak, but it's also weak in that other line anyway. And the queenside structure is a really sound structure, let's say. So this is a very deep concept, which reminds one of Nimzovich's concepts. But Morphy was a bit earlier than Nimzovich, right? In the timeline of history. Anyway, so he did this intending this very deep endgame concept, and we get to see this in this game. So what happened here is that black, as we said, develops the bishop on the most normal diagonal. This is very important to keep in mind because I played some games in this Raphael variation. I was playing the black side and I didn't know that the bishop belongs here. They were blitz games, of course, but I just casually developed and put my bishop on d7, later c6. But most games I wasn't able to play the bishop to c6, so that kind of sucked. But if I knew where the bishop belonged, that would have helped me so much. So anyway, white castles, of course, and yeah, here the knight interestingly develops to h3, and the idea is that, well, if it develops to f3, white would probably just snap it off. That does indeed, let's say white develops to f3, you just snap it off. That does indeed remove the very powerful bishop, but you're gaining huge structural advantages. After you castle now, you have this very strong attack on f3 that basically can't be parried, only with like bishop g3, bishop g2 or bishop e2. And after those moves you have like a strong blockade here with rook f4, and then you take care of this pawn and just get the second rook, and this pawn is isolated, these pawns are all weak. So yeah, I think the structural advantages really outweigh the losing the strong bishop. So that's why white develops with knight h3. He could maybe develop to e2 as well, but he chose to go to this route because he also protects f2. To go for this variation because he protects f2. So rook f8 happened. Cleverly, black doesn't castle, because if he castles, then after let's say bishop b5, he has to play the awkward move c6 or bishop c6, and he doesn't want to do that. So okay, let me show you what I'm trying to say. So if he castles now, he leaves d7 tender. So after bishop b5, If he plays c6, he kills his own bishop. And if he plays bishop c6, he trades off his own bishop. And he can't capture with the knight because he loses d7. So this variation doesn't work. So he has to play, and this after bishop b5, probably has to play rook d8, and then the move rook, the rook isn't optimally placed, and yeah, it's a bit of a problem. Maybe he can continue with a6, b5, but probably he doesn't want those pawns on those squares. So he cleverly goes for rook f8, not castling. And also don't forget it's an endgame, so not castling makes sense. And white gets off this diagonal, makes lots of sense. Knight c6, black wants to complete development, also attacking e5, which is again the weakness Morphy sought. And f4 protects it. Also notice how the h3 knight now protects f4. So that's 1 plus point for the knight on h3. Now black advances his king. It's an endgame. So he also puts it off like in the far future, and he's checking diagonals from the light squared bishop. It also helps prepare d6. And overall it just activates the position. So g3 is played, intending to play bishop g2 and kind of face off against this bishop on b7. So black doesn't mind that idea, just goes for d6, trying to break down the center, make better use of this isolated pawn, and really just blasting open the center for the king and the rooks to infiltrate and attack black's weaknesses, white's weaknesses, especially this weakness, this glaring weakness that Morphy sought from the beginning of the game. So bishop g2. Now Sargent says that this move is terrible, and I do agree. This move is the kind of move that works tactically but fails positionally. And I've seen this countless times, not just among, like I say in the comments, it's among intermediates, but by intermediates I mean upward to FM level, to even GM level. These kinds of moves, they plague the worst players. When I see a game by a stronger player and I see the stronger player outplaying the weak player, I notice usually these types of moves where like the move works tactically, but there's like a positional idea or a concept that it's not fulfilling. So bishop g2, yeah, it works tactically because you can't take twice, because the bishop on b7 is hanging, so you can't just do this. Okay, that's the, let's say, brilliant tactical idea here. But on the other hand, positionally it doesn't make sense because it leaves white with an isolated f-pawn. So in this position, probably white should just take. But anyway, bishop g2, d takes e5, f takes e5, and here Morphy goes for rook f5, which is a brilliant move. It adds pressure on the e5 pawn. So white just protects that. Black goes for rook d8, trying to trade off a pair of rooks. And after g4 and the trade happens, and again you can't take here because of the hanging bishop here. So again, tactics but not positional ideas. So g4 was an interesting move. At least it kicks off the good rook on f5 and stops the attack on e5. But it's also positionally bad because you're putting it on the same squares as your bishop. So positionally it seems like Mr. Lichtenstein didn't really, or was basically outplayed by Morphy. So he goes for trading the bishop for the knight, which I'm also not sure was necessary. Maybe he thinks trading down will help him against Morphy, but because he's not getting slashed by Morphy. I mean, Morphy was a fine endgame player, and it's on full display here. And that's really why I want to show the game as well. It's not just that Morphy was a swashbuckling, romantic player. So King D2 is played, and that's a good idea. First of all, it's a dark square, most important thing. And second of all, it's activating the king. So yeah, that's a good move. Now, okay, I'll show you what Morphy played now. If you want, you can try to think about it if you if you haven't looked at the move list. But anyway, Morphy played the brilliant h6, which is really a fine endgame display, because after g5 he locks all the pawns on the king side on dark squares, which is the opposite color of this bishop, and that's brilliant. So you have all these pawns on the dark squares, then h6 g5 will be on the dark squares. The only weakness left would be this, but that's fine because you have all these strong points. So that's a very important idea. So he goes for that, and after rook e3 and g5, so very important, keep this in mind, and b3, white is just trying to expand, but again he's putting the pawns on the light squares. Maybe he should go for b4. Rook f1, aiming to attack the weaknesses from behind, but white trades off, and black really has no reason not to trade off. If he goes here, white just follows suit. If he goes back, he really doesn't have, I mean, the d file isn't such a great open file because the squares could be controlled by c3 or c4, and the rook there doesn't really have any entry points. So they trade, and this position also trading helps Morphy anyway, because as we said, the structure is very bad for white, and it only gets accentuated when these trades happen. So bishop e4 attacking the c2 pawn, king d2. Okay, so c4 loses to bishop b1. Obviously, it loses a pawn to this familiar bishop. Like Pac-Man mode stuff, but c3 doesn't lose a pawn, because after bishop b1 you have a3, and if this you have this. So that was probably a better idea. King d2 is just it's not a mistake, but probably misplacing the king somewhat, because the king, okay, well, you'll get to see what I'm talking about later, but yeah, the king doesn't belong on this side of the board, the queen side. This is a slight inaccuracy, actually, king d2. The king belongs on the king side, and you'll see why in a moment. So just normal moves. Black comes in with the bishop, and white activates his knight with a tempo. So here, actually, white sets up a clever trap. So if black wants to repeat, then white is fine with it. He has the worst position, and well, he's facing Morphy. So, but he's also saying at the same time, if you don't want to repeat, so if you want to actually go after my pawns, your bishop will be trapped. But this is exactly what happened in the game. And Morphy has seen further. He has seen that after the bishop sacrifice, it is only he who has winning chances. And in fact, this game, it's the fourth game in the semi-final match between these guys. And I think it was basically an unofficial game, because Morphy had already won 2.5 to 0.5 by that point. But it was played anyway, and the game wasn't recorded after. Well, after this point, the game wasn't recorded, but somehow white lost. And it is said that Morphy and Mr. Lichtenstein played several games after this game, and it's either black drew the games, or, well, not both players drew the games, or black lost, or black won. So this bishop sacrifice was brilliant, and Sargent says that basically what Morphy did is make sure that he has a draw in hand, but he also has winning chances. So that's really great. And so after c6 and 92, we have this endgame position, which I'll analyze in a separate chapter. It's a really, really instructive endgame. So technically speaking, this endgame is drawn, but making the draw is not easy at all. The first question you have to ask yourself is, what should White's plan be? And the plan is outlined by these arrows. So White should probably go king c3. Oops, I removed the arrows. And the knight should come to d4. So king c3 protects the knight on d4. And from d4, the knight attacks e6. And black can't defend then because the d6 square is covered by white's e5 pawn. So the king can't come to the rescue of the e6 pawn, and the pawn will be lost, and white will probably win. So that's one idea for white. The other is in this knight plus king versus king plus pawn majority type of positions, is to ask yourself, where does the king belong? Where does the knight belong, and where does the king belong? Ask yourself this question now, and maybe you'll come up with a solution. So most likely it's the knight that belongs on the queen side, and the king that belongs in the center and on the king side. Now why is that? Because black is aiming to just jettison all these pawns, distract the knight with these pawns, or the king with these pawns, and just gobble these pawns on the king side and promote to a queen or to queens. So when white's king is on the king side, he prevents that idea because black's king would be blockaded. He can't enter to the king side. But leaving the knight on the king side allows black's king to infiltrate, because the knight isn't so good at boxing out the black king, while the king here, let's say, will block these squares, while if the knight is here, he'll only block these squares, and the king is free to, well, these squares as well, but the king is free to infiltrate from these squares. See? So if the knight is here, the king is free to infiltrate from these squares. So that's really the key concept of this endgame. So let's consider some things. After b5, which is really an amazing move, by the way, a5 is also possible, but b5 seems better because it directly forms a threat. C takes b5, c takes b5 just gives black two passers, and they'll be too strong. Now, Beat Giant from chessgames.com, he said that maybe knight g1 has the idea to liquidate the king side. So you play knight f3 and h4 and trade off all the pawns on the king side and hope to make a draw, but it's too slow, as evidenced by this line. So here you do somewhat get to liquidate the king side, but after this and a later king e5 and this, you're easily winning. What about c takes b5 and king c3 here? Again, you have b4 check, king b3, and the king infiltrates and you win. So this is because the pieces are on the wrong side of the board. The king shouldn't be on the queen side, it should be in the center and on the king side, and the knight shouldn't be on the king side, it should be on the queen side. So after bishop takes b takes c4, now this is a much better move than before check, because before check really, well, first of all you gain a free pawn, of course. Before check doesn't do that. But before check is really too slow because these pawns are easily blockaded. Now b takes c4 on the other hand, it leaves this pawn to able to run, and both these c pawns are also able to run, so it leaves white with more chances of passers. And really, double pawns in endgame are mostly an asset. Well, I mean past double pawns. So we're considering this line. This is a line given by Ripka. It gives this as a draw, and that's not too far off from the truth. Yeah, this might be drawn, but it's not the right way to go about things. So notice I'm saying the knight belongs on the queen side, and the king belongs on the king side. But there may be some like crazy way to draw this position that Ripka found. I haven't made like a rigorous analysis of this line, but even if that's such a case, it's such a line would be very narrow, like only moves at every turn. While if you keep the king on where it rightfully belongs, which is the center, and the queen and the king side, and the knight on the queen side, you'll have a much easier way of drawing this. And the draw that Stockfish finds anyway is with keeping the king on the king side. Yeah, with keeping the white king on the king side. So I won't pay too much attention to Ribka. Okay, so for SF's line, after bishop b takes c4, you go king d2. And so you're repositioning your king toward the king side and center. And here white doesn't really have an option to advance his queenside pawns because they're easily blockaded by the knight. And here you waste the tempo with h3, which is a very important move. Because after c5, black is the one who runs out of moves. So now he runs out of moves, and you easily draw this. Well, not very easily, but also notice how you're in the nick of time to protect the g4 pawn so you don't lose it, and it ends up being drawn. So that's the best line, and that's the smartest way. You have to reposition your king toward the center and toward the king side, while your knight takes care of the queen side. Okay, so anyway, that's the correct way to draw. But probably Mr. Lichtenheim didn't play this, and that's why he lost. So this is another interesting line given by Tamar from chessgames.com. But in this line, really, the mistake is knight d4. The only drawing move is king d2, as evidenced before. Knight d4 just loses to king d5. And after knight f3, Mr. Tamar gives c5. But c5 is probably wrong here, because white has the liquidating move h4, and after this, now in this scenario the pawns are too weak and they will fall. So like this position, it's just drawn. Notice here how this is a double attack. So again, h4 is a key move to liquidate, and the position just ends up drawn. So c5 is a mistake, but after king e4 and knight d4, etc., now the black king infiltrates and picks up all the kingside pawns, and it's an easy win. But after c5 and knight d2, it's again yeah, it's lost for white. But after c5, which is an incorrect move, h4 needs to be played, which immediately draws. So yeah, that's an interesting endgame analysis. And there's this line from Ribka which says that knight a2 is the drawing move. And then this line continues as such. And lo and behold, who's winning? Black. Black is winning here. So, and it actually gives this a zero eval, so it shows how weak Ribka is in endgames and how weak engines in general are. Actually, here in this position, Mr. B Giant asked why a5 doesn't work, and it's a5 is a good move actually, as you can see from the stockfish eval. So that was a very interesting endgame, and we learned a lot from this game. So I'll cover the summary points and then bid you a farewell. And I, of course, hope you will learn a lot from this video. Okay, so we learned where the pieces belong in the Raphael variation of the Dutch defense. So the white's dark squared bishop should be traded off. Because white is trying to push e4. White's knight belongs to c3. That's the defining move of the Raphael variation anyway. Black's bishop, light squared bishop, belongs on b7, where it exerts the greatest pressure, has the best control. The knights belong on f6, c6. White's knights also on their natural squares. The rooks belong on the e files probably and the d files. The white queen probably belongs on e2, h5, h6, and the black queen unclear but probably e5. And the black bishop, of course, belongs, the black's dark squared bishop belongs on e7 most likely, and probably from f6 it should go to g7. So those are some key points. We also learned that in the battle of knight versus bishop, knight plus king versus king plus some pawns, the optimal side the knight should be on and the optimal side the king should be on is a very important consideration that you should acknowledge when you want to correctly play this endgame. So in our example, the knight was best positioned where? Yup, on the queen's side, while the king was best positioned in the center and on the king's side. So that's another aspect we learned. Third of all, we learned about the pawn advances and how they leave weaknesses behind, and how an isolated pawn can be weak in an endgame, and how to exploit that, and the weaknesses of overextending your pawns, etc. And fourth thing we also learned about was the fact that putting your pawns on the opposite color of your bishop is very important in endgames. So that gives you stronger endgame play. So I think that's about it for what we learned in this video. Those are 4 very important concepts you should keep in mind. And thanks again for watching. I hope you got something out of this. And I hope that Morphy's brilliant endgame play actually inspires you to not just go for swashbuckling tactics, but also to play brilliant positional games like him. Thanks, guys.